Have you ever seen a UFO? Bigfoot or some ghosts? On Tactiles, there's Susie. She is the host. We really like to hear from you. You can tell us then all about the aliens. And if you're one of them, we really need to know. We really need to know. Really need to know, or we will come and get you in the night.
Hi, welcome to Out of This World with Susan and Willy. I'm your host, Susan Spooler. Today, we will be interviewing Peter Robbins live from his home in Ithaca, New York. And Peter has been doing UFO research for over 40 years, and we welcome him to our studio. Peter?
Thank you, Susan. Good to be back.
Thank you. So, Peter, tell us, how did you first get interested in the UFO phenomenon?
Very much against my wishes on a certain level. When I was a kid, all I ever really wanted to be was an artist. I was quite prolific as a young person. I had, special oil painting lessons. I continued on as a big fish in my little pond through high school. Studied art at university and then transferred to the School of Visual Arts in New York. For my money, still the finest art school in America. And once I graduated, I joined the faculty as a painting instructor and taught there for over a dozen years. I was at a point in my life where I was really living my dream, painting, making part of my living doing construction work during the Soho, New York building boom when that district was being renovated into artists' galleries and the like, and teaching painting at night. And one afternoon, something happened to me that has never happened before or since. A profoundly important memory from childhood, which I had obviously repressed, resurfaced. And it was of a very unambiguous multiple UFO daylight sighting that I had had as a kid with my sister Helen. It upset me tremendously. I don't know whether or not even at that time in the 1970s, the term repressed memory syndrome was, in the lexicon. But I couldn't believe that you could suppress a memory like that, and yet it came roaring back for reasons that I think I understand now, not necessary to go into. I guess most important, though, that my mind was ready to deal with it. And once I had kind of calmed down, I decided to call my sister to see if she remembered the same thing. I had thought it out enough to not just blurt it all out and say, "Do you remember?" and have her say yes or no. And I very carefully set the scene, the time where we were playing on the front lawn of the village we grew up in, about 30 miles east of Manhattan. And she not only confirmed it in detail, and we hadn't spoken about it for over 14 years, but she went on to tell me something that was so disturbing to me that my life literally changed in the course of the conversation. I really had no interest in the subject as a young person. I saw some of the great B movies on Saturday morning at our local theater with my young friends, but I guess I implicitly accepted the adult admonition that it's nonsense, it's not real, and never really gave it two thoughts. And certainly nothing around what we now call the abduction phenomena. And my sister then went on to tell me archetypical flashes of memory of somebody who is taken, is face to face with these other intelligences. In Helen's case, they were archetypical grays, and one very tall one. That was a term that wasn't around either. There were no Well, there may have been a few books that mentioned it. I certainly wasn't aware of any. And I was beyond shocked. For a moment, I contemplated that my sister was having a mental episode, and then caught myself saying, but 8 seconds ago it was okay for 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects in a V formation close enough to see windows hanging over the Parker's house across the street. And my life changed that afternoon. And I'll tell you what, I resented it. My dream had now been challenged in a way. I continued to paint and teach and show my work, but more and more I was playing at it. And ultimately went into this work, I can't say full time, but I worked in New York theaters, an off-Broadway house manager, continued to do contracting to a degree, had any number of jobs, but this thread continued. I began to sell articles, speak at conferences, and here we are now all these years later, with most of the questions still very much unanswered.
Okay. Wow. So it was quite traumatic then once you realized what was going on with you.
Yeah, I within a year, because I was so split on this, I literally couldn't reconcile the fact that the things that we saw, unless we had the technology to create disc-shaped objects that could fly at very high speed, stop on a dime, disappear, whatever, in the 1960s, which I very much doubt, that we were living in a schizophrenic world of people who knew, either through a sighting or an experience or through study, that we were not alone, and that there was this advanced technology, very likely representative of other intelligences coming and going from wherever with impunity. And I ultimately found a psychiatrist who helped me integrate this. One of the reasons that I sought him out was I had read several things by him when I was younger, talking about he had had 2 sightings in his life, and at one point had the courage and tenacity, and I guess to a degree the naivety to publish around it, and almost lost his license to practice psychiatry as a result. But Dr. Baker helped me tremendously to just understand such things exist, and if this was an area where I felt I could make a contribution and that I did have an obsession with, which I did and still do, to get on with it. And I did, and I am.
How old were you when this experience happened, when you were with Helen, your sister?
I was 14, she was just 12 years old.
Okay. And did anyone else experience this sighting? Sometimes this happens, like when my mother had the sighting when she was pregnant with me in Leominster back in the 60s. There were other people that saw the craft.
Yeah. I have no idea. I know that when I really got into the work in earnest, I was able to visit the newspaper morgue of Newsday, which was the big paper in that part of Long Island. And based on the time that we established that it happened, go backwards and forwards for months looking at the microfiche, and there were no articles. Remember, however, that most folks are still reticent to make reports because of the extraordinary ridicule factor that's attached. And if you're going to report it, who are you going to report it to? Are you going to call the newspapers? More than likely, they'll think you're a crank. Are you going to report it to the police? Are you going to call the Air Force, which after 1968 you couldn't do and didn't make much of a difference if you did? If other people observed it, I have no way of knowing.
Okay. That's good. So then from there, once you made this discovery and spoke with the doctor, where did things blossom from there for you?
Well, for the first months I was involved in it, I started to look in the paranormal or the mystical areas of bookstores. UFO books, even the most scientific ones, are often still categorized with the occult. Not a good thing, and that is changing in some bookstores, but not others. And I started to buy books and read them, being very clear on which ones I thought were specious nonsense and mystical crap, and other ones like Donald Kehoe's writing, the first really scientific writer on the subject, a very respected Marine fighter pilot from World War II and one of the first bestsellers in the field. But I really wasn't very interested in meeting other people who purported to be studying the subject. I figured they were nuts. However, I was very fortunate in having three mentors in those first years. One, a military scientist who was a retired staff officer of the Hungarian military and had served as chief photo analyst for the Hungarian army during World War II. The other was a tough, no-nonsense Italian-American Brooklyn, New York City police detective, highly decorated, who not only took the subject seriously, but was himself an extraordinarily good UFO investigator, specially trained by the NYPD in the 1970s to do hypnotic regression for criminal investigation, and applied that to working with witnesses like my sister and myself. And lastly, Bud Hopkins, who was also a painter and is probably better known for most people as the real pioneer researcher in the scientific investigation of the UFO abduction phenomena. Bud and I went on to have a 35-year friendship. And probably for about part of that time, I worked as his assistant, confidant, and coworker. And in that sense, I guess I had the best education and training anyone ever could to move forward as an investigative writer in this field.
Can you expand upon Bud Hopkins? Those of us or those people who are out there that are new to this phenomenon may not be familiar with Bud and what his contributions were.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Bud, and you can Google him, probably get thousands upon thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hits. I have no idea how many talks and television programs, etc., you will find, and that's Bud with two Ds, B-U-D-D, on YouTube. But Bud is the author, was the author. He passed in August of 2011 at the age of 80 from cancer, of four of the finest books on the subject that you can find. The first was Missing Time, about this phenomena that accompanies the abduction experience often, that has really entered, the entire English language. When people say missing time, even if you're not interested in the subject, the association is with the UFO phenomena. He went on to publish another incredibly important book in 1987 called Intruders, the true story of the Copley Woods UFO. I forget the last part of the subtitle. That was an international bestseller made into a miniseries by CBS. Then he wrote the book that I was most involved in called Witnessed, the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions, involving an otherwise archetypically normal New Yorker of a certain variety who had been taken and returned since she was a child. And one particular event that happened to her in 1989 at night in Lower Manhattan that was multiply witnessed by dozens of people that came forward, and who knows how many that did not come forward. And finally, in 2008, 3 years before he passed, he wrote a fascinating and unique American memoir called Art, Life, and UFOs. Bud was a very fine painter, coming in at the end of abstract expressionism, who continued to paint once he became world famous as this key person in UFO studies. One of the most intelligent people, one of the most extraordinary intellects, and had he gone into law enforcement, God help the criminals who would have come up against him. He was a natural detective, and his work is superb reading. And for anybody on an entry level, I would recommend it highly. It's shocking, but it's extremely well documented, and we'll probably never see his like again.
No, he lived there in New York State as well, did he not?
Oh yeah, he was born in West Virginia, but after he graduated with his degree in fine arts from Oberlin College, followed a very traditional path of moving to Lower Manhattan, getting a loft and starting to paint. And he lived the rest of his life out of his home on West 16th Street and spending his summers in Cape Cod, where he also had a residence.
That's right. That's right. So how did you end up meeting Bud?
I was maybe a year into the work, again, very reticent to make contact with other alleged grown-ups who took the subject seriously. I certainly felt the ridicule factor myself, and it estranged a number of friends. And again, I was reading, I was able at that point to be pulling up old articles, many of them, rather outlandish or sensational, and reading the books. And one afternoon, and this would have been in 1976, I happened by a newsstand and did a double take because I saw a headline on one of our papers, a weekly called The Village Voice, which at the time was primarily a political newspaper leaning toward the left. And I certainly had never covered this subject as far as I knew. And it was a case investigation by a man named Bud Hopkins of an event that took place, I believe, the year before in New Jersey. And it went on to become, I believe, the case of the year for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which is the largest UFO organization in the world then and now. And I read the article, and I was so impressed, Susan. It was so well researched, so well documented. The work that he put into it, the account of the witness, the credibility and the character of the witness, the events surrounding it, the other witnesses peripherally to the event, all rang true. And I thought, I've got to meet this guy, but where do I know this name from? The art world in New York, although world renowned and very impacting on the rest of the international art scene, is fairly small. And if you enter into it, like any area of specialty involvement, you get to know the names, ultimately may meet some of the players, etc. And I realized that this was Bud Hopkins, the painter whose work I was vaguely familiar with. There was only one Bud Hopkins in the New York City phone book. I cold called him, introduced myself as another painter, taught at Visual Arts, had gotten involved the year before through this memory from childhood and through my sister's account of, being taken. The first question he asked me was what kind of art I did. And all very partisan. He was not a big fan of the minimalist conceptual field, but he was fascinated by my sister's account, and he invited me over for coffee. And a few days later, I showed up, and we sat at his kitchen table. And I think back now, it's so funny the way our lives work. And we talked about art and life and UFOs. There was no way I could know at the time that it would be the first of hundreds of such talks at that table, and that I would go on to work very closely with him over the years, be lucky enough to have him as one of my dearest and closest friends and a confidant all through the time that Larry Warren and I were working on our book about Britain's Rendlesham Forest case, and right up until his death. So yeah, that's how I met him.
Isn't it funny how these relationships are formed, and and you'll please, if you tell us about Rendlesham, and if I could just start to talk about that, please, and then I'll add my angle on that whole experience.
Yeah.
So, please.
Well, the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, as it's come to be known, is, for starters, Great Britain's best known and best documented UFO incident. It's sometimes referred to as Britain's Roswell, not because the circumstances surrounding the events of summer of 1947 outside of a town in New Mexico are similar, but simply because of their notoriety and fame. It happened on 3 consecutive nights. The event was actually a series of incidents over 3 nights between Christmas and New Year's 1980, and happened primarily in forest areas surrounding 2 very important NATO bases at the time, RAF Woodbridge and 5 or 6 miles away, RAF Bentwaters, where the overwhelming number of personnel involved as witnesses were stationed. And the story broke internationally. in a series of articles from Great Britain's the biggest tabloid in the world at the time, the News of the World, now destroyed because of the corruption of the Murdoch organization. But the individual that made this happen was the whistleblower on the case, a former Air Force security cop who had been involved as a witness on the third night to a shattering event. All of the men, I should say, the key eyewitnesses, were put through hell by military intelligence, really screwed around with, and suffer comparative post-traumatic stress even 35 years later to combat veterans. It's absolutely unconscionable what was done to these men, but 2 years after leaving the service with an honorable discharge, the man who went on to become my co-author, Larry Warren, connected up with a Connecticut UFO researcher named Larry Fawcett, who was also a police captain in Coventry, Connecticut. And the account that Warren gave Fawcett put into the form of a Freedom of Information Act action, which resulted in the release of a single-page official document, a memorandum, which, while written by the deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters several weeks after the fact, it compressed, it redacted, it reduced the event, but there it was on an Air Force letterhead with the signature of a colonel. And for many years, that was the only document we had. So it was Larry and Larry's courage alone in going forward that resulted in the release of it. We met briefly the following year in Westchester during an extended town meeting taking place in the largest local high school, which was packed to the gills, I believe on a Saturday afternoon, regarding the overflights of dark triangular-shaped objects. That this was at the beginning of the video revolution, and a lot of people had filmed it. It had affected the behavior of farm animals. It drew a tremendous crowd, including Whitley Strieber was there at the time.
That's right, he wrote Communion.
Yeah, Whitley was not known for this by any means. He was still some years away from writing Communion, which came out in 1987, a very important book. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was there, arguably the most famous person in the world regarding the subject of UFOs, who basically played himself in a small cameo at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Larry was there, and we met briefly. But 3 years later, we met in earnest at the MUFON International Symposium, which marked 40 years since Roswell, and which took place in Washington, D.C. at American University. I heard him speak. He heard me on a panel discussion. I decided I wanted to do an interview with this guy. Alleged military witnesses are not uncommon to find, but the truly authentic ones are rarer indeed. And I felt he was one, and indeed he was. And he had another agenda, which was he had decided I was the guy he wanted to write his book with. And we met briefly in the hallway on that Sunday, exchanged pleasantries, set forth, I told him I wanted to do an interview. He said, when? I said, well, when's good for you? He said, how about next weekend? And Friday after work, he was at my house, at my apartment on East 46th Street, gave me the interview of my life at that point. And Sunday, before he headed back home to his wife and home in Connecticut, I asked him what this was, why he did this. And he said, I think you're the person I should write a book with. Yeah. Laid out his terms, which I thought were extremely honest, that began with, prove me wrong. Do whatever you need to do or can do to establish that I'm not telling the truth, that I'm a psycho, a wannabe, a Manchurian candidate. But if you can't, then do your best to back me up. I thought I was taking on a project that might take a year or two, cost us each a couple of $1,000s, take us to England. Susan and I had no idea what I was in for. We both essentially went bankrupt. We returned to England on our own and together about 15 times at our own expense. It was a thankless project. It was very anxiety-provoking at times. There were times I wished I had never gotten involved. When it came out in America, our agent made a really substandard deal with a publisher here who turned out to be one step away from a felon. The book continues to sell here, but it was a smash bestseller in the United Kingdom. And the country really regarded it well overall. And it secured my reputation in the work and Larry's, although both are still being attacked all these years later. It is that loaded a case, and there is a great deal invested in making people feel that it was less important than it was, or to take their attention away with science fiction explanations or dueling witnesses, which is a shame, but it is what happens sometimes when you embarrass the forces that be. In this case, Her Majesty's government, the Ministry of Defense, the United States Air Force, they don't forgive.
Interestingly, one of his cohorts there, who was also in the military police there for the Air Force, Stephen LePlume. My father and Stephen's father were in the Air Force together, and coincidentally, I graduated from high school with his sister, and he was a year before me in high school as well. I didn't know him, but I've been friends with his sister for many years. And last year when we had our UFO conference, he was one of our speakers.
Yes,
but it's just fascinating, all these coincidences and connections that are made throughout time.
As MC and a speaker last year, Steve LePlume's talk for me was the high point of the conference. This is a great guy with a lot of courage who was not involved in the specific Rendlesham Forest incident, but had his own, which certainly changed the course of his life. Right. And his courage in coming forward, especially to a hometown audience, cannot be underestimated. And I believe that talk is posted on YouTube for anybody to watch. It's incredibly moving and incredibly informative.
Yeah, it was. It's fascinating what the military can do when they're involved with these.
That's right.
Phenomenon. So.
Yeah.
But I thank you for sharing that, and I still enjoy my autographed copy of your book in my library, proudly up on the shelf. So, well, Peter, it's been a distinct pleasure and honor to have you here on our show, and we're doing this to let people know that we'll be having various speakers at the Greater New England UFO Conference. Our website is www.newenglandufo.com. That's www.newenglandufo.com. And we will be having the event on Saturday, October 17th, 2015.
And may I jump in just for a closing, first to thank you for the opportunity to speak with your audience here. It's an important event. And one, for me, emblematic of efforts by local communities to begin to work with some of the world's best investigators and researchers to bring this incredibly important subject to a wider audience. So please attend if you can.
Yes.
Support it. We all want this to become an annual event.
Yes,
and Susan
absolutely.
and Willy, thank you for your tireless work. And Steve Fermani for getting this thing going when we first started out.
Yes, that's
so
right.
all the best to all of you, and looking forward to being back into Leominster in 2016.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Have you ever seen a UFO? Bigfoot or some ghost?